Thank you for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's learning webinar. I'm Melissa Demashke, Vice President of Programs at the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation. We're a Great Lakes funder located just north of Detroit and in the greater watershed of Lake Erie. We're thrilled over 40 people registered for today's webinar. While we would love to meet all of you, we simply don't have enough time. So instead, I invite you to share your name, affiliation, and location in the chat. As many of you know, toxic green slime is growing in lakes all over the country, including in our Great Lakes, and more specifically to today's program, Lake Erie. It prevents us from recreational activities like swimming and fishing, in some cases contaminates our drinking water supply, and also impacts our economy. Excess nutrients from agricultural fields and urban areas fuels the growth of these harmful algal blooms. Improving water quality is a significant part of our foundation's mission. Our foundation has supported over $22 million in efforts to address urban runoff in the Detroit metropolitan region and in rural areas of Southeast Michigan to keep nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen on farm fields instead of in our rivers and lakes. It's through this grant making the foundation became aware of Environmental Working Group and its expertise in producing powerful geospatial maps. We saw how they were helping in other parts of the country clarify problems and identify opportunities for implementation to speed up more effective use of conservation practices. Partnering with the Joyce Foundation based in Chicago, the foundation made a grant to Environmental Working Group to use GIS tools to identify where phosphorus might be most concentrated in Michigan to then focus implementation of effective farm conservation practices. The Joyce Foundation funded similar work in Ohio. Today's program will focus on what resulted in Michigan. First, you'll learn from Environmental Working Group about the work they did in Michigan. Then you'll learn from two of Michigan's state agencies how they're using the tools created by Environmental Working Group to catalyze effective implementation of farm conservation practices in Michigan's portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin. Throughout the presentations, we invite you to type your questions in the Q&A, which you'll find in the lower left, bottom left of your screen. We'll do our best to review and answer all the questions at the end of today's program. I'll now introduce the great team from Environmental Working Group. Today we have Ann Schechinger, who is the Midwest Director, and Ethan Bahe, a GIS analyst. I also want to thank Sarah Porter and Jamie Konopacki, former team members with Environmental Working Group. This team, all four, did such a fantastic job of developing these tools. They hosted monthly meetings with the state agencies to provide updates and receive feedback on how the tools were being developed and could be most helpful, all while they were manually making edits to 40,000 fields, and that's just in Michigan. Ann and Ethan, please share with folks more about these tools.
Thanks, Melissa. I will share my screen here. Okay, everybody can see the slide? Perfect. So thanks again. I'm Ann Schechinger. I'm the Midwest Director for EWG, and our Midwest office is in Minneapolis. And I'm here with Ethan Bahe. He is a GIS analyst out of our Midwest office. And just so we have some street cred, I'm actually from Michigan originally. This project is super personal to me because I'm from an area of the Western Lake Erie Basin in Michigan. And Ethan's also from the Midwest. He's from Iowa and he's an agronomist. So we have a lot of experience with this topic. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about our recent manure nutrient loading analysis and precision conservation practice placement in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So just a little bit about EWG for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. So our mission statement is to empower you with breakthrough research to make informed choices and live a healthy life in a healthy environment. So two of our main focus areas are really public health and environmental health. And we conduct research and also publish projects on our website to help inform our audience about how different sources of pollution impact their health and the environment. And we also do some work advocating for changes in government policies to make them better for people and the environment. So our project within the Western Lake Erie Basin fits in well with our mission to promote public environmental health. As we all know, everyone has seen many of these photos that's on this slide. There's a toxic cyanobacteria bloom in Western Lake Erie every summer, largely driven by phosphorus and nitrogen runoff within the Western Basin. And Ohio State University has found that around 85% of all phosphorus runoff that ends up in the lake comes from agriculture. So there's really this huge opportunity to help farmers in the basin reduce the amount of phosphorus that runs off their farm fields. And keeping this phosphorus on farms can improve the health of the lake, but it's also beneficial for farmers and residents in the basin. So the goals of our project really were to find areas of likely heavy phosphorus application to farm fields within the Western Lake Erie Basin, and then use a software toolbox to model which precision agricultural conservation practices could be employed in the phosphorus focal points to reduce runoff. And we did this through three main steps. So the first step really was to locate all of the animal feeding operations within the Western Lake Erie Basin, and then calculate how many animals and what types of animals each of these operations housed. And then from there, we calculated how much manure was produced by all animal feeding operations, as well as the amount of manure phosphorus that was produced. And for the second step, we modeled which fields near these animal feeding operations were likely to have manure applied to them. And then finally, which is what we're going to talk most about today, we use the inputs from the first few steps together with the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, or ACPF, toolkits, which were developed by the USDA ARS, to build out crop rotation and soils data, and then define the placement of these conservation practices identified for phosphorus focal points in 13 subwatersheds in Michigan's portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin. So I'm going to quickly go through each of these steps. I know it's a lot, so definitely feel free to ask questions at the end. But this first step of the project was really to locate all animal feeding operations in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So we received the locations of the largest animal feeding operations that require a permit through public records requests with the state agencies, as well as state agency online resources. And then we combed through aerial imagery of the entire basin to manually find the locations of all unpermitted operations. So this is really an EWG pioneered approach. We have a lot of experience using this methodology to find AFOs in multiple other states, including, North Carolina, Iowa, and Minnesota. And we are releasing our Western Lake Erie Basin report and maps later this week. So since we haven't released it yet, we aren't showing the full map publicly until Thursday. That's the day of our release. But the map on this slide shows the animal feeding operations that we found in the Michigan portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin, where the 18 blue points are the permitted facilities in Michigan, while the green ones are the unpermitted facilities, and we found 169 operations that did not need a permit in the Michigan portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin. So once we found those locations of the operations, we really looked at the imagery for each individual operation and assigned animal types based on visual attributes of the operations using EWG's methodology. And then we used measurements of the operations sizes to estimate the number of animals housed by each operation, and we compared those to USDA's 2017 Census of Agriculture estimates. So this isn't just EWG's estimates, we're making sure that it double checks with the Census of Agriculture as well. And then finally, we used academic and industry data to calculate how much manure would be produced by each operation, as well as the amount of phosphorus contained in the manure. And just for an example, we have two photos here of two animal feeding operations, what they look like when you really zoom in on aerial imagery. And the bottom image with the long barns is a poultry facility, whereas the top image with the shorter, wider barns is a swine facility. So we're able to manually identify animal types based on the attributes that we can see in the aerial imagery. So that was the first step of this process. And then once we calculated the likely amount of manure and manure phosphorus produced by each animal feeding operation in the basin, the second step was really to model which farm fields near the operations likely receive that manure as a fertilizer. So we first used parcel data as a starting point, And we manually edited the field boundaries to remove things like water or forest land or large building sites so that we would be accurate on field size and location. We then use 6-year crop rotations to determine what crops are grown on every field within the basin. And this is USDA data as well. This is not EWG data. We went through and saw a 2015 to 2020 crop rotation on every farm field, so we can know, how much fertilizer or phosphorus fertilizer is likely used on these fields. So this image shows, for example, a bunch of these fields with their crop rotations. So the field that says C, B, C, B, B, B over there on the left side would be a field that grew corn, followed by soybeans, followed by a year of corn, and then 3 years of beans. So here we actually know, what was grown within the last 6 years. And we also used all that data to calculate how much phosphorus would be removed by crops when they are harvested for every field. So we did this using those 6-year crop rotations as well as government yield data. And then we use estimates of how much phosphorus should be applied to the specific crops from extension recommendations to generate likely phosphorus application for each field in the basin. So we use EWG created data and a lot of government data and even industry data to kind of come up with these estimates. So finally, this is the end product we were trying to get to. We at the end use an algorithm that spatially applies the manure from each operation to individual crop fields based on their phosphorus application recommendations and the proximity to each animal feeding operation. And we did this using a peer-reviewed methodology to calculate specifically the manure that's applied to crop fields. And this methodology can be found in Porter and James 2020 in the journal Agronomy. So we applied the same peer-reviewed methodology from that study to our analysis in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And once again, we aren't releasing the Western Lake Erie Basin phosphorus focal point map until Thursday, so we haven't included it here, but we wanted to give an example of what this modeling of manure application to farm fields really looks like. So this image is from our work in Minnesota. And in this case, the orange fields are the fields that likely were applied with manure near animal feeding operations using all of the steps I just described. So our manure application map of the Western Lake Erie Basin will look very similar to this. So now we're going to really talk about step 3. So I'm going to hand it over to Ethan in a little bit to talk about, one of the most important steps of the project, which is really defining optimum placement of conservation practices in 13 watersheds in Michigan. So we currently are also working on defining these optimum placement of conservation practices using the ACPF on 13 watersheds in Ohio. And the goal of this work is really to reduce phosphorus runoff at the end of the day. The modeled practices show the very best ways to reduce phosphorus runoff on farm fields. So these are real on-the-ground suggestions of how farmers can reduce phosphorus getting into Lake Erie. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ethan.
Thank you, Anne. So using the ACPF is a very time-intensive process, both in building the core data itself and using the ACPF toolkits on a watershed. The first step is to download or create the ACPF core data itself. There's a slight distinction here that can be a bit confusing. The ACPF core databases are containers that contain the base data, but no analysis has been done on it. While the ACPF toolbox is a set of ArcGIS models that are used to analyze the inputs and produce optimum locations for conservation practices on the landscape. The ACPF core databases for watersheds may be available from the National Hub. And for those of you familiar with the Western Lake Erie, you may notice that this map is a little bit odd. It's missing a large chunk. Of the 585 Huck 12 watersheds within the basin and a 5-mile buffer, 188 of those watersheds were already available for download from the National Hub. So we did not need to create those. However, we did create the core databases for the 397 remaining watersheds within the Western Lake Erie Basin. And these are now available from the National Hub. Some of the data is downloaded from existing data sets, such as soils data from NRCS's Gridded Soil Survey Geographic Database, or GSURGO, while other data sets need to be created. The most time-intensive part of setting up these databases is either creating field boundaries from scratch or updating the field boundaries to current standing via aerial imagery. Once the field boundaries were finalized, we built out the core databases that I showed earlier. And these databases are the starting place for the ACPF and require an important piece of additional data as well as analysis to create the optimum conservation practices. The important piece of additional data required is called LiDAR, or light detection and ranging imagery. So LiDAR can be loosely compared to sonar, and is used in a number of everyday applications like car crash sensors and the 3D mapping of construction sites. The type of LiDAR we used consists of a laser pulse sent down from a LiDAR unit in an airplane, which bounces off an object and returns to the sensor, giving an elevation value linked to a geographic coordinate. These points are then averaged together to create what we call a DEM, or digital elevation model. The DEMs that we used have a cell size of 1 meter and with an elevation value attached to them. Now, on the left here, you can see a sample DEM that is 6 cells by 6 cells. Each cell contains an elevation value, and as part of the ACPF tools, the model will determine the flow direction by finding the lowest cell next to each cell and having water flow to that cell. Once we have flow direction, we can start to have flow accumulation. The flow accumulation is when the model essentially puts 1 drop on each of these cells and then follows it through the flow direction. The cells in the box on the far right show a count of how many cells pour into them. And this is how we get what we call a flow accumulation raster. And we use this flow accumulation and flow direction to give us a flow path once the flow has accumulated. And we generally used a 2 acres of accumulation as our starting point, but the user can choose whatever they like. Now for a more real world example. What you see here is a sample DEM that actually comes from a watershed that I worked on, overlaid on a hillshade to give us a little bit more of a 3D representation. If you look at the stream here, you can see that there are a few areas where the stream goes under a driveway or under a road. As LiDAR is captured from an airplane, it is unable to capture the route water takes whenever it is covered from above. Because of this, we need to complete a task called hydro enforcement or hydro conditioning. If we run the flow accumulation and flow direction tools without doing anything to the LiDAR, we get outputs that look something like this. Here you can see the same DEM, but you can tell that the water is backing up or ponding behind these areas where the roads are causing a dam on the landscape.
Yeah, and I think Ethan froze.
Yeah, something must have happened to his computer. I can keep going until Ethan comes back.
Great.
So I am totally not the GIS person, but I will try my best. So he was talking about, making these cuts through hydro conditioning. So in this instance, you can really see that these dark lines look like, water is backing up, but you have to make these cuts to make the water flow. So here's one where you would make the cut, and here as well. So the circle in red here, you can see 4 cut lines. These are used in the areas where the water flow is impeded in the model as it flows under the road or driveway. So at this point, we run the model again. So the ACPF toolboxes again, and we get a new DEM as well as new flow accumulations and directions. So you have to make these cuts to the imagery in these GIS software to make sure that flow essentially is going in the right place. You know, we can't determine where to put a conservation practice to reduce phosphorus runoff if we don't know where the water is flowing.
I apologize, Anne, I'm back.
Okay.
Technical difficulties. So here you can see that these cuts have been placed, and now there are small lines through the road in these areas where the elevation values for the DEM have been lowered to the level of the stream. And if we run this through the model again, you can see that all of that water that had backed up previously is no longer backing up. And the flow paths, I can get them, the flow paths are now following along with the stream and not jumping out of the stream banks as it was earlier. It's worth noting here, though, that the area, there are more cuts that would need to be made to this DEM before it would be considered ready to run through the ACPF toolbox. The area shown in this view alone required another 17 cut lines before it was considered complete. And it's less than a square mile. Some areas of a watershed may be better, and some areas may be worse, just depending on how many driveways, how the water is flowing through the model. Once we finish what the hydro conditioning or hydro enforcement step, then we get out an updated stream network, an updated watershed boundary, and an updated set of catchments. Now, in black, you can see the original boundary, where in red, you see the new boundary to the watershed. For the most part, they stay the same, but there is a little bit of movement in some watersheds. And then here you see individual catchments where a segment of stream is all drained, the drainage basin to a specific section of streams. So it's at this point that we can start running the model through the rest of the ACPF toolbox, and which will assign potential locations for the precision conservation practices. We did this again for 13 Huck 12s in Michigan, and we're currently finishing up 13 in Ohio. It's worth noting here that each watershed requires individual assumptions to be made because each watershed is unique. It's at this point that I want to walk through another real-world example looking at a section of landscape. If you look at the 4 circles on here, I want to highlight these 4 areas, and I'll invite you to kind of try and remember what these look like, as they will get covered up as I show the practices on the landscape. The first practice I want to talk about is grass waterways. And the green lines you see here represent the places where the model has indicated that grass waterways could be beneficial on the landscape. It's not saying that you have to put grass waterways, but these are kind of best case choices for where to place them. For those who may not know, a grass waterway is an agricultural engineering practice used to convey runoff from the field without eroding the soils. It's used in low areas where water tends to collect and run off and would normally lead to erosion. The next conservation practice I want to talk about are conservation buffer strips. These are embankments used to intercept sheet flow, and they, as it runs across a field. They're generally placed along long continuous sections of slope where the water will pick up momentum if unimpeded. And I'll point to this area as an example. If the water flows along this line without contour buffer strips, it has a long unimpeded flow line. But if you add the 3 contour buffer strips, or even the 2 larger contour buffer strips here, you break up the length of travel that the water can go in down the slope and intercept that flow before it picks up speed across the landscape. And the last practice I'm going to talk about are WASCOBs, which stands for Water and Sediment Control Basins. These are very similar to contour buffer strips, but smaller, and they're built with the embankment is built with a basin behind it, so that the basin will intercept and hold water and then slowly release it. This delayed release helps to allow sediment to settle out of the water before both the sediment and water would exit the field. If you look at these 2 circled areas, you'll notice that there are multiple conservation practices listed in the same location. Now, you're not going to place these conservation practices overlapping, but what this allows for is it allows for local level input on which conservation practices are right for the local landowner and local stakeholder. And then if you think back to that first image where I had this circle on the left, these WASCOBs were actually placed on the landscape by the model in the same location that WASCOBs are physically in the landscape today. So I thought that was kind of a great serendipity. And as just a final note, this is only a small fraction of the outputs of the ACPF toolbox, but I am unable to spend enough time, and the map would get very cluttered if I kept showing each one on top of each other. And with that, I want to hand it back to Anne, and so that she can conclude our portion of the talk.
Thanks. So just we wanted to end talking about some value added of this work. So we feel like through our ongoing APO work, EWG has really created methodologies and analytical techniques to find and attribute these APOs that can be used in places throughout the country. And we also know, modeling can often be very useful, and sometimes it can be not useful at all. But what really sets this work apart is that the maps that we've created in this final step of the project show the specific conservation practices that could be implemented within farm fields to reduce phosphorus runoff, and they give precise locations within those fields that describe where to put the practices. So the project isn't theoretical. It actually has maps that show where these conservation practices would have the biggest impact on reducing phosphorus runoff in the basin. And so then state agencies and conservation districts can work with farmers to really implement these practices on the landscape. And it's great that farmers can have certainty that they are having an important impact on reducing nutrient pollution into Lake Erie. So with that, I want to say thanks for listening, and just do another thank you to the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, as well as the Joyce Foundation, for supporting this work.
Thanks so much, Anne and Ethan. It's just tremendous what you've been able to do. And I know your eyes hurt a lot from looking at all those thousands of fields. So thank you so much for all the effort you put into this. I think that's a great segue to the next set of speakers we have. Before I introduce them, though, I just want to say again that please submit any questions you have using the Q&A on the lower left portion of the webinar on your screen. So next, I'll introduce Thad Cleary, Pete Vinson, and Jim Johnson. You heard me earlier mention the monthly meetings. These three were on many of those calls, providing the excellent input that Environmental Working Group really needed to refine these tools. Their time was much appreciated. And now that they have these tools, they're going to share the next steps and what it will mean for Michigan to implement these conservation practices and reduce phosphorus into Lake Erie. Thad will speak first. He's with the Water Resources Division of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Pete Vincent is also with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and he'll participate during the Q&A portion. Following Thad will be Jim Johnson, who is the Director of Environmental Stewardship Division at Michigan's Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Go ahead, Thad.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Let me know when you can see the presentation.
We can see it.
Okay. Let me get back to slide one. Good afternoon, everybody. Like Melissa said, I'm Thad Cleary with I'm in the Non-Point Source Program Water Resources Division. And I'm going to just kind of quickly go through how we're trying to incorporate the ACPF into dealing with the issues down the Western Lake Erie Basin. And I'm going to start out by first talking about the agricultural inventory process that we developed in the Non-Point Source Program and how we've incorporated the ACPF that Ann and Ethan talked about. First, I got to quickly go over kind of why we developed this ag inventory process. So we fund in the Non-Point Source Program, we fund the development of watershed plans, and we had a number of watershed planning projects developed in agricultural watersheds. You know, these were 2-year grants. It was a long time, a lot of money. And they would go the 2 years and they'd get done and they'd say, yeah, we need, you know, nutrient management, cover crops, no-till, filter strips, tile line control structures. But they didn't say where those practices were needed in the watershed. So that's what kind of led us to this, developing this whole process for our watershed planning projects. And now we've incorporated that into how the state is trying to address the issues in the Western Lake Erie Basin. The other big thing, because they didn't identify the locations of where practices were needed, you know, when it came time for implementation of practices, it was the basic, send out newsletters, we send out postcards, put articles in papers. We had projects for implementation to pay for cover crops and filter strips. And it was kind of whoever came into the door and, you know, saw that and wanted to do something. So whether or not we were hitting the sites in the areas that were really contributing the pollutant loads it was totally up in the air or not. So that kind of led to this agricultural inventory process. And the purpose of this process that I'm going to kind of walk through is basically we're looking at the field's natural characteristics of given sites and then how that field is farmed to identify those fields that have the greatest potential of contributing pollutants, sediment, nutrients, pathogens to surface waters. And we basically there's 3 components of this process that we've developed. And the first one is the ACPF that Ann and Ethan just went through. The second component is a desktop analysis, and then there's a field inventory component. So with the ACPF, you know, we were looking at all of that information, where the flow paths, where that tool with the LiDAR data is showing all of that water is flowing from. And also the ACPF tool will give you what the slopes of those actual fields are from that LiDAR data. So we know which fields had steeper slopes and which fields were flatter, which obviously has a lot to do with runoff that's going to leave those crop fields. In addition, like they mentioned, it identifies a potential location for practices. So where are grass waterways needed? What fields may be appropriate for tile line control structures to hold water back. So that was kind of our first component of that information for our ag inventory process. The next component is the desktop analysis. They already talked about the field boundaries. EWG through the grant from the Erb Foundation has digitized every crop field within the Western Lake Erie Basin. So if that part is done for the entire Western Lake Erie Basin, we have all crop fields digitized. And then from there, with the desktop analysis, we're identifying, based on where the streams and the ditches are located from the ACPF tool, which fields are next to water bodies, which of those fields are within, say, 50 feet of water bodies, how many fields are within 300 feet of those water bodies. Obviously, proximity has a lot to do with potential of contributing those pollutants. And then looking at aerial photographs, we went through and identified for those fields, say, that are within 50 feet, how many of those fields had filter strips? So grass filters that farmers planted there between their crop field and the surface water bodies. And then additional information is, because we have it in Eagle because of the CAFO permits that we issue, we know what fields potentially receive CAFO manure applications. So we were able to add that attribute, that piece of information for these fields as well. Now that's just CAFO manure. It's also not CAFO manifested manure. It's manure they're applying to their farm. So it's not all the CAFO manure, but it's the manure we know where it's potentially going. And then as Ann explained, the livestock locations. They went through and identified where all the small and medium livestock locations are. We don't know exactly what fields, but we have an idea. We know that manure stays within a certain proximity to those actual locations. So we have some idea of where that manure is going. And then the third component is our field inventory component. And this is what our conservation district staff partners are going out and collecting this information. And basically what we're doing here is this is actually driving the watershed. Every one of these digitized fields that they can see from the road, they're documenting this information. So they'll go out in the fall after harvest has occurred and after all tillage is going to be done. So it usually doesn't start until December, and it can go into January and February collecting this information. They'll document what crops were planted and what type of fall tillage was done. So they'll document whether it was chisel plowed, which is a more aggressive, versus maybe a mulch plowed, which is a less aggressive tillage practice. They'll identify which fields didn't have any tillage done at all, which fields may have been planted to a cover crop as well. So what we're looking for here is we know if it was a corn field that was harvested for silage, or if it was a soybean field and there was chisel plowing done, we know there's not much residue left out there. So that's kind of what we're gauging on, what we're looking there, how much residue based on the crop and the tillage, what do we have out there over the winter and early spring. And then those technicians from the conservation districts go back out in the spring after planting's done, before the crops get too big, and they'll identify what crops were planted, but then also how much residue is left. So how much, is it greater than or less than 30% residue? That's kind of the cutoff from a soil erosion perspective. Is there zero residue, or was it planted no-till method? If it was no-till planted, we know it's greater than 30, but we want to document how much no-till is actually occurring. So all of this information is being collected from the ACPF, the desktop analysis, and the field inventories. And then what we do is look to take all of that information and try to identify which fields, based on those the natural site characteristics, the slopes, proximity to water bodies, and then how's the field being farmed? What are the tillage practices? How much residue, manure applications? And try to identify which fields, based on those attributes, have a higher potential of contributing sediment, nutrients, and phosphorus. And this is just one example that we ran in the Lime Creek, a subwatershed in the Bean Creek. So we looked at the proximity. We started with proximity, 50 feet. We also did another look at ones that were 300 feet and had higher slopes. We took into consideration the tillage practices that they did, the spring residue that was left over, the applications. And we came up with identified roughly the highest 32% of the acreage. So now, instead of, sending out a newsletter that's saying, okay, we have this cost share to do cover crops or no-till or filter strips, we actually now can be proactive, figure out who owns these fields, farms these fields, and start going to talk to them. Because most likely, if we're going to see a meaningful reduction in pollutants affecting surface waters, it's going to be trying to get to those fields that are likely contributing to that. There's studies have shown, a vast majority of those pollutants come from a small majority of the acres in the watershed. So that's what we're trying to find, is what fields are likely contributing, and try to get practices on those fields. So that's kind of how we've taken the ACPF and the other components of the ag inventory to kind of help us get those dollars on the fields where we can hopefully have the best chance of seeing water quality improvements. Then there's also just the ACPF, the information in there. The technicians at the conservation districts can utilize that information, help them. They can, before they go work with a farmer, can look at slopes of fields that are out there and such. And so it's kind of got dual purposes there of this information. I just want to give you a quick glimpse of kind of where we're at. We have marked on here some USGS gauge stations that have been installed. The four southern ones there, Lime Creek, Stoning, Niles, and LaPointe, are already in place. The state's working on getting another USGS gauge station up by Saline there in the headwaters of the Saline. And that's basically just to monitor over time as hopefully practices are implemented. Do we see change in water quality at a HUC 12 level? And then this is the rest of it's just kind of showing you where we're at as far as where the ACPF is being developed. The dark green ones kind of in the middle there, those are the 13 that EWG did with the Erb Foundation, the funding from the Erb Foundation. And then some of them we've already done, the Lime Creek ones, the lime colored ones over there, Cobell Lime, those have been, the ACPF is done, the ag inventories are done. And now we're basically at a point of getting this information online for conservation districts to use, to work one-on-one with producers here. And kind of our next steps are, our goal is to try to get the ACPF run on the rest, the remaining HUC 12s in the Western Lake Erie Basin, the Michigan portion. Hopefully within a year to a year and a half, that can be completed. And then continue working with the conservation districts to extend field inventories out to additional HUC 12 sub-watersheds to collect that information to kind of help us try to prioritize where to put practices on the ground. Went through that as quickly as I could to give us more time for questions, hopefully. So thank you.
Thank you, Thad. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're fitting this all together within our bigger plan for addressing 40% reduction in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Before I start, though, let me first say thank you to the Erb Family Foundation and the Joyce Foundation. They have been great partners in this entire process and been extremely important to our work in the Western Lake Erie Basin. It's very clear that they truly do care about this community. I also want to thank the Environmental Working Group. Their technical abilities have made a huge difference in our thinking about addressing non-point nutrient issues in the basin. We're in a much better place, as has been described, to assure that limited resources can be used in a more efficient and effective way. The fact is, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. The EPA total phosphorus reduction goal for Michigan in the Western Lake Erie Basin is 750 metric tons. To date, point source reductions through the hard work of Eagle and dozens or so local wastewater treatment plants in Michigan accounts for approximately 450 metric ton reduction so far. As that moves forward, they'll be really close to about 500 metric tons over subsequent years. The challenge is a great one on the non-point agricultural side. We're dealing with approximately 1 million acres, agricultural acres, with thousands of agricultural fields, owners, and operators. A much bigger task than dealing with a couple dozen wastewater treatment facilities. But we will still need to document about another 250 metric tons of reduced phosphorus from these non-point sources. So the job ahead of us is pretty significant. What isn't clear on this scale is how much needs to be done to begin to see water quality changes. We have had a gauging station measuring water quality at the mouth of the River Raisin since the 1990s, but it covers a very large portion of the 1 million acres in the basin. The work of the Environmental Working Group will allow us to focus our efforts on specific fields, as Thad described, that are predicted to be at risk of contributing nutrients to surface water. We are initially working with 5 sub-watersheds. Each one, as he pointed out, has its own gauging station. Well, we're going to set the 5th one. 4 of them do right now and have been collecting background data. We'll set the 5th. But all of those will be for monitoring water quality in a much smaller HUC 12 watershed. Because these watersheds are relatively smaller areas, we should be able to see water quality improvements as the gauging stations, at the gauging stations as the BMPs are put in place over a much shorter period of time. What we don't know is how short is that period of time. Working in smaller watersheds will serve as proof of concept for continued field by field efforts in all other areas of the Western Lake Erie Basin moving forward. So even though we're going to start in these initial 5 sub-watersheds, as we move forward, we're going to continue to work with farmers in the rest of the basin with the hope that the work in the initial 5 sub-watersheds will provide evidence that this kind of a more focused effort on those fields that are predicted to be contributing the most will actually result in identified reductions in surface water quality nutrients. This path forward with the backbone of the Michigan Domestic Action Plan, which lays out the process and tactics, and the Adaptive Management Plan, which recognizes the uncertainties that are part of complex social and environmental systems, will be a more organized approach to this large and complex problem. Truth is, I'm grateful to the very capable team working on this. I'm also very grateful to the wonderful partnership with the Erb Family Foundation. And with that, I will stop and we can take questions. Melissa?
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Thad. And yeah, just to echo that, we really have appreciated our partnership, not only with Environmental Working Group, but with both state agencies. You know, I keep bringing up these meetings. I was so impressed that everyone was on board every step of the way with this project. And I think what we've seen is it's been a really, meaningful project, and hopefully we'll see it as a really impactful project too in the coming years. And I appreciated both Thad and Jim, how you shared how, your plan and intention is to use these tools to help clean up Lake Erie. Again, I just thank you both so much for your participation in this project, and look forward to learning more about what this impact will have in the coming years. Well, so to our listeners, please keep submitting your questions. I see that we have a few already. We do have some time to share and discuss them. So at this point, I am excited to introduce the Foundation's Great Lakes Program Officer, Amanda Herzog. She manages the Foundation's grant making to improve water quality from agricultural and urban runoff, and will moderate today's Q&A.
Great, thank you, Melissa. So the first question is, how is tilling incorporated into the modeling?
I guess my question is that for our modeling or for Thad's modeling?
I think probably Thad's.
Was it tilling or tiling?
Oh,
Tiling.
Both good questions.
Yeah, I think
Tiling, sorry.
So from a tiling perspective, so the ACPF tool does have components in it for identifying fields that are likely, based on soil types and such, that are likely tiled. And it actually has an output that'll show you where saturated buffers, say, which are associated with tile outlets, and that can be used. In our ag inventory process, we've actually talked about, you can see on aerial photos, you can actually see where, if you get the photo at the right time of year, you can actually see which fields are tiled. You can see like a grid on the photo. And we've actually talked about kind of making that another one of our attributes of putting that in and documenting which fields are tiled and which aren't. The thing is it's in certain areas, especially in the Western Lake Erie Basin, a vast majority of those fields are tiled already. So it's, the assumption it's almost easier just to assume the fields are tiled, and but the ACPF tool can help with that some.
So I'll just add a little bit here, Amanda, that we know that this is one of the gaps in our understanding, which is part of the reason why the two departments have actually been funding a research project with Michigan State University to understand what we call edge of field research project. Basically, what we're doing is we're looking at what's happening at tile line openings and how we can better manage tile lines throughout the entire year, actually, to better manage the nutrients that are in the water that is going through those tile lines. The old technology was that tile lines ran straight across the field and they all emptied into a drainage ditch. Today, those tile lines now have what's called a lateral line that intercepts every one at the edge of the field, and there's an end point of release that can be controlled. And what we're doing is we're studying the control of that end release along. Actually, we've got every field divided into free run, what we call free run, and then ones that we're actually managing. And we've been doing this now for 3 years. We have 3 years worth of really good data. The study is supposed to end at the end of September. We really need 2 more years of data in order to be in a better place. But I think just like nutrient management planning and pesticide management planning, I think another plan on the farm is going to be stormwater management. And that's what we're trying to learn here is what can we do to manage the stormwater in a better way to reduce the risk of releases from those fields. And like I said, I think we're learning a lot. We need a couple more years. We need more variety of weather over those couple of years in order to assure we have a good representation of weather patterns. But that is another way that we're learning here, and we'll use that information to create another set of questions within the Michigan Ag Environmental Assurance Program around stormwater management, and probably in the end require, as part of the verification process for fields, some sort of stormwater management plan as to how the farmer is going to manage stormwater releases from their fields throughout the entire year. It's been a fascinating process. I think it's going to be very useful as another BMP.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, how are soil phosphorus levels considered in this analysis? And what considerations are given if there is continuing excess phosphorus applied?
So that is a good question, because it's obviously a major issue, because phosphorus is what we're changing here. Unfortunately, the ACPF tool, looking at aerial photos or even driving by a field, we're not going to know which of those fields may have excess phosphorus on them. So that's where I think it comes down to more. That's where it's critical to have local, conservation district staff out there working one-on-one, talking to these producers. And because nutrient management should be the first practice that you're going to want to talk about. I mean, that's where we need to start, obviously, when we're trying to address phosphorus. But I think with the ag inventory process, when we know that usually if manure is being applied, there's a chance that there's going to be a potential for phosphorus buildup there. So we know those fields have that potential, and those may be ones we want to look at as a priority then, both whether it's from CAFO manure or from smaller or medium livestock operations. So that's one aspect. The other, yeah, there's no way, I guess, the other thing I guess we're looking at is also looking at those soil phosphorus levels. At what point does it become a risk from a water quality perspective? At what level, when the soil test phosphorus level reaches a certain point, at what risk is there? At what point is there more risk from the surface water quality perspective?
Great. This is another question for you. Do you know how many of the landowners, farmers in the basin that are working on nutrient reduction using the techniques discussed also have conservation easements on their land? As the largest land trust in Southeast Michigan, we are always trying to figure out how to connect the farmers that trust us based on our relationships with them to organizations, groups, funds to help with phosphorus reduction.
So we do have an example from the past. I mean, doing conservation easements, it's not a common practice. We did have, when the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program started 20 some years ago, DEQ, at the time we put some funding in to do permanent conservation easements on some of those crop practices, filter strips, some of those whole wetland restoration sites. That was funding through the Clean Michigan initiative that we did that. And then I guess more recently, I think, Jim, if you wanted just to mention the saline, the drain easements and that potential project up in the saline watershed. You're on mute, Jim.
Muted, and I never made more sense. Anyway, yeah, I appreciate that, Thad. And so one of the other things, and we've done a lot to try and build up the number of different tools, financial tools that we might have for putting practices in place. One of those is we just made application 2 weeks ago with EPA for the purchase of farming rights along drainage ditches up in the Saline River. And that's been a long process to get there. I think we're going to get funding. It'll be the first phase of that entire process. But one of the other challenges we have always is the long-term implementation of best management practices, especially these kinds of best management practices along riparian areas. And this would actually be a permanent easement to those areas specifically for implementation of some sort of grass buffer area along those drains. And so that's yet another tool. It's part of the reason why the saline is being added on here at the end of this process. The drain commissioner in Washtenaw County was more than willing to help us out with that kind of a project. So we're looking forward to seeing how that actually goes.
Thank you. And this question is for Ethan. It came in a little bit earlier. Can you provide a list of the other best management practices that the ACPF modeled on the landscape?
Sure. So there are some that are things like the grass waterways and contour buffer strips. But there are also some that are there aren't necessarily management practices, but more assessments. So there's the runoff risk assessment. And that basically just throughout the entire watershed grades which fields in a watershed are kind of the most likely to run off versus least likely to have runoff issues. Then edge of field bioreactors, grass waterways, contour buffer strips. Depression identification is another one of those that isn't necessarily a management practice, but it can show where depressions are in the landscape, where some water issues might be in a field. Drainage water management, nutrient removal wetlands, farm ponds, wascob and wascob basins, a riparian function assessment and denitrifying practices, along with creating riparian catchments, which is kind of an interesting tool because it breaks the stream down into 100-meter, I think it's 100-meter, but short sections of stream, and then creates a catchment just for that section of stream. So in the example of some of the monitoring stations, you could more readily know what is upstream of that monitoring station. So if you're picking up a certain spike or high level on a monitoring station, you have a little bit better knowledge of where to go and kind of start looking for a problem.
Okay. Then, oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Well, I was going to say, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, and for all of you that are at time, we are recording our webinar, and we'll be posting this on our website and notifying everyone that is registered when it's available. So the next question is, there is an economic incentive for commercial phosphorus to be reduced so BMPs can contribute to increased profits, but manure is a waste. A BMP, like cover crops, can hold more phosphorus in the soil, reducing phosphorus that needs to be applied. But the BMP that keeps phosphorus could be a problem if the same amount of manure is applied. How does the economics, et cetera, factor into this?
So any quick responses to this final question?
That is a very valid question. That is, it's, you know, the statement is true. The question is true. It's, you know, putting out excess commercial fertilizer isn't as likely to happen because you got to pay for it. And the manure, it's generated, and sometimes it's, you know, you're looking at what's the cheapest cost to get rid of it. And I think that's the hurdle we need to get past is figuring out how to get those nutrients from the manure to the fields that need it, not fields that already have more phosphorus than the crops need. And I think it goes back to, we need to really look at and decide if the levels that we've set of building those soil phosphorus levels up to, are they protective of water quality or not? I think that's where we need to start, is figuring that out and then start working from there.
Great. Well, thank you, Thad. Thanks to Amanda for moderating the Q&A, and to all our presenters, Anne, Ethan, Jim, Thad, Pete, thank you for joining us as well. And thanks for all of you for listening, learning, and asking your great questions today. I'm certainly encouraged by the tools that Environmental Working Group developed and how the Michigan state agencies are using them, and encouraged that we're on a path to a cleaner Lake Erie. So thank you all. Have a great day.